The 6 hours Bumpy Johnson controlled every nuclear weapon on Earth. At 3:47 a.m. on October 16, 1962, every nuclear weapon on Earth went silent. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey stopped responding to Pentagon commands. Soviet R-7 ICBMs in Cuba refused Moscow's launch codes. British Polaris submarines in the North Atlantic lost contact with London. French Mirage bombers carrying nuclear payloads over Algeria received no signals from Paris. In a single moment, humanity's entire nuclear arsenal, over 7,000 warheads capable of ending civilization, fell under the control of one man. And that man was sitting in Small's Paradise nightclub in Harlem, smoking a Cuban cigar and studying a briefcase full of activation codes that should never have existed. For 6 hours, Bumpy Johnson would hold the fate of humanity in his hands. What he demanded from world leaders in exchange for giving back control would reshape global power forever. The Cuban Missile Crisis had the world balanced on the edge of nuclear war. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were locked in the most dangerous standoff in human history. But neither leader knew that their ability to destroy each other had just been removed by a man who understood something they didn't. Real power isn't having nuclear weapons. It's controlling who can use them. To understand how Bumpy Johnson gained control of every nuclear weapon on Earth, you have to go back to 1957. The space race was beginning, and both superpowers were desperate to demonstrate technological superiority. The Soviet launch of Sputnik had shocked American intelligence agencies, who realized they were losing the competition for global influence. That's when someone in the Pentagon made a fateful decision. Instead of relying entirely on government scientists, they would secretly recruit the best technical minds from organized crime. Criminals, they reasoned, had experience with complex logistics, secure communications, and operations that couldn't be discovered or traced by enemies. The recruitment was handled through intermediaries, defense contractors, technology companies, even academic institutions that had connections to both legitimate research and illegitimate activities. Nobody in the government knew exactly which criminals were being consulted. Nobody in organized crime knew exactly what projects they were supporting, except Bumpy Johnson. He made it his business to know everything. In 1958, Bumpy received a visit from Dr. Marcus Webb, a former MIT professor who was working as a consultant for a company called Advanced Systems Research. Webb was nervous, sweating through his expensive suit despite the cool October evening. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you have connections throughout the technical community, people with skills that might be useful for certain government projects." Bumpy studied the nervous academic. "What kind of projects?" "The kind that require absolute discretion, the kind that involve national security, the kind that could change the balance of world power. And what makes you think I'd be interested in helping the government?" Webb pulled out a briefcase and opened it on Bumpy's desk. Inside were photographs of military installations, technical diagrams, and financial documents showing payments in the millions of dollars. "Because, Mr. Johnson, this isn't about helping the government. This is about being part of the most important technological development in human history, and the people who control that development will control everything else." Over the next 4 years, Bumpy became the invisible broker between the criminal underworld and America's most classified military projects. He provided technical expertise from safecrackers who understood complex locking mechanisms, electronic specialists who had learned their skills circumventing alarm systems, communications experts who knew how to create untraceable networks. Most importantly, he provided something the government desperately needed but couldn't officially request: the ability to steal technological secrets from other countries without leaving any evidence of official American involvement. By 1962, Bumpy controlled a network of technical specialists who had access to classified information from every major nuclear power. Soviet missile guidance systems, British submarine communication protocols, French nuclear trigger mechanisms, Chinese uranium enrichment processes. Information flowed through his organization like water through a carefully designed irrigation system. But Bumpy wasn't just collecting intelligence, he was building something that no government had ever attempted: a master control system that could override the nuclear weapons of every country on Earth. The technical challenge was enormous. Each country's nuclear arsenal used different command structures, different communication frequencies, different authentication codes. Creating a single system that could control all of them required understanding not just the technology, but the psychology of the people who had designed it. Bumpy's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to hack into existing nuclear command systems, he would create a shadow network that mimicked them perfectly. Every nuclear weapon system relied on radio communications to receive launch orders. If he could intercept those communications and replace them with his own signals, he could control which weapons fired and which didn't. The Shadow network took 4 years to build. Bumpy's technicians installed radio transmitters at over 200 locations across 6 continents, each one positioned to intercept and override nuclear command signals from specific military installations. The transmitters were disguised as commercial radio equipment, hidden inside legitimate businesses that Bumpy had purchased or infiltrated. The network was tested gradually, in small segments, using non-nuclear military equipment. A radar installation in Alaska would suddenly switch frequencies. A missile guidance system in Nevada would lose contact with its control center for 60 seconds. Each test proved that Bumpy's network could override official military communications without being detected. By October 1962, the Shadow network was complete. Bumpy Johnson possessed the ability to intercept and control nuclear launch orders from any country in the world. All he needed was the right moment to use it. The Cuban Missile Crisis provided that moment. On October 14th, American U-2 spy planes photographed Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles being assembled in Cuba. President Kennedy was informed on October 16th, and the most dangerous 13 days in human history began. Both superpowers mobilized their nuclear forces. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey were armed and targeted at Soviet cities. Soviet R-7 ICBMs in Cuba were prepared to strike American targets. British and French nuclear forces were placed on high alert. The world moved closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before or would ever be again. But on the morning of October 16th, Bumpy Johnson made a decision that would change everything. Instead of allowing the crisis to escalate toward nuclear exchange, he would remove the nuclear option from both sides. He would force Kennedy and Khrushchev to resolve their differences through diplomacy instead of destruction. At 3:47 a.m. on October 16th, Bumpy activated his Shadow network. The effect was immediate and total. Every nuclear weapon system on Earth that relied on radio communications, which was virtually all of them, stopped responding to official commands and began receiving orders from Bumpy's transmitters instead. In the Pentagon, military commanders stared at control panels that no longer responded to their inputs. In the Kremlin, Soviet officials watched helplessly as their most powerful weapons became unresponsive. In London, Paris, and Beijing, nuclear forces went offline simultaneously. None of them understood what was happening. The technology required to accomplish such a feat was beyond what any single country possessed, and the coordination required was impossible for any known intelligence agency to achieve. At 4:15 a.m., Bumpy made the first of 6 phone calls that would terrify world leaders and prevent nuclear war. President Kennedy, this is Bumpy Johnson calling from Harlem. I believe you're having some technical difficulties with your nuclear arsenal. John F. Kennedy was awoken in the White House by his national security advisor, who handed him the phone with a bewildered expression. Who is this? I'm the man who just took control of every nuclear weapon in America, and Russia, and Britain, and France, and China. For the next 6 hours I decide who lives and who dies. Kennedy's voice was ice cold. This is impossible. No one has that capability. Mr. President, I suggest you check with your Secretary of Defense. Ask him why your Jupiter missiles in Turkey aren't responding to launch commands. Kennedy put the call on hold and contacted Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. 3 minutes later, Kennedy returned to the phone, his voice shaken. What do you want? I want to prevent nuclear war, Mr. President, and right now you and Premier Khrushchev are marching toward exactly that, so I'm removing your toys until you both learn to play nice. You can't hold nuclear weapons hostage. This is an act of war against the United States. Bumpy's laugh was cold and dangerous. Mr. President, this is an act of peace. For the next 6 hours, nobody can start a nuclear war because nobody can launch nuclear weapons. You and the Premier are going to have to solve this crisis the old-fashioned way, by talking to each other. The second call went to Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow. The Soviet leader was equally shocked and outraged, but he also quickly grasped the implications of the situation. You are American spy, Khrushchev accused. I'm not anybody's spy, Premier. I'm a businessman who doesn't want his customers incinerated in nuclear fire. Bad for business. What is your demand? Same thing I told Kennedy. You two are going to negotiate a solution to this crisis without the threat of nuclear weapons hanging over everyone's heads. You're going to act like civilized human beings instead of cavemen with atom bombs. The third call was to Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in London, the fourth to President Charles de Gaulle in Paris, the fifth to Chairman Mao in Beijing. Each leader received the same message. Their nuclear weapons were temporarily under new management, and they would remain so until the Cuban crisis was resolved peacefully. The sixth call was to United Nations Secretary General U Thant in New York. Mr. Secretary General, this is an opportunity for the United Nations to fulfill its primary mission, preventing global war. For the next 6 hours, no country can threaten nuclear destruction. Use that time wisely. Over the next 6 hours, something unprecedented happened in international relations. With nuclear weapons removed from the equation, world leaders were forced to negotiate based on diplomatic and economic considerations, rather than threats of mutual annihilation.
Kennedy and Khrushchev, speaking through intermediaries and direct communication channels, began working toward a solution that neither had been willing to consider while nuclear weapons remained an option. Without the ability to threaten nuclear war, both leaders had to focus on practical compromises. At the United Nations, Secretary General U Thant proposed a framework for resolving the crisis. Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba in exchange for American missiles being removed from Turkey, and both superpowers would commit to pursuing arms control negotiations. Normally, such a proposal would have been rejected by both sides as showing weakness to their enemies. But with nuclear weapons unavailable, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev could afford to appear unreasonable in front of the international community. At 9:47 a.m., exactly 6 hours after Bumpy's shadow network had activated, nuclear weapon systems around the world suddenly came back online. Command and control systems that had been unresponsive for 6 hours began receiving signals from their official military headquarters. But by then, the framework for resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis had been established. Kennedy and Khrushchev had both publicly committed to U Thant's proposals. Neither leader could back down without losing face internationally. The crisis was resolved peacefully. Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba. American missiles were removed from Turkey. Both superpowers began arms control negotiations that would lead to the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. Nuclear war had been averted. Humanity had survived its closest approach to self-destruction, and nobody knew that it had been prevented by a Harlem gangster with a briefcase full of radio transmitters. The official history of the Cuban Missile Crisis credits the peaceful resolution to the diplomatic skills of Kennedy and Khrushchev, the mediation efforts of U Thant, and the rational calculation that nuclear war would benefit no one. All of that is true, but it's not the complete truth. The complete truth is that for 6 crucial hours, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation, the power to end human civilization was held by a man who understood something that world leaders had forgotten. Real strength isn't the ability to destroy your enemies. It's the ability to prevent destruction altogether. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the 6 hours he controlled every nuclear weapon on Earth. When asked by associates about rumors that he had been involved in resolving the Cuban crisis, he would simply smile and say, "Sometimes the best way to win a war is to make sure it never starts." The shadow network was dismantled immediately after the crisis ended. Bumpy's technicians removed the radio transmitters, destroyed the communication equipment, and scattered to different countries. The capability to override nuclear command systems was deliberately eliminated to ensure it could never be used again by anyone. The technical specifications for the shadow network were buried so deeply that even Bumpy's closest associates never learned how it had worked. The knowledge died with him in 1968, but the impact of those 6 hours continued to shape world events for decades. The Cuban Missile Crisis became the turning point in Cold War relations, leading to détente, arms control agreements, and the gradual reduction of nuclear tensions. Historians credit this change to the shock both superpowers experienced when they realized how close they had come to mutual destruction. They're not wrong. What they don't know is that the shock was artificially induced by a man who understood that sometimes you have to take away people's most dangerous toys to force them to play peacefully. In 1963, President Kennedy established the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first major arms control agreement of the nuclear age. In his speech announcing the treaty, Kennedy said something that puzzled historians for decades. "We have learned that the most powerful weapons are useless if we cannot control them. Real security comes not from the ability to destroy but from the wisdom to restrain that ability when restraint serves the greater good." Nobody understood what Kennedy meant by "cannot control them." The phrase didn't match any known military doctrine or strategic theory. But in Harlem, people who knew Bumpy Johnson understood perfectly. The 6 hours that Bumpy controlled every nuclear weapon on Earth proved something that military strategists and political scientists had never considered. The most effective way to prevent nuclear war isn't building more nuclear weapons or creating better defense systems. It's ensuring that when world leaders reach for the nuclear option, they discover that option isn't available. On October 16, 1962, humanity came within hours of nuclear extinction. But at the crucial moment, when both superpowers were preparing to cross the line into atomic warfare, they found that someone else had already moved the line. Someone who understood that real power isn't controlling nuclear weapons. It's controlling the people who think they control nuclear weapons. For 6 hours, Bumpy Johnson held the fate of human civilization in his hands, and he chose to save it by taking the choice away from everyone else. The world never knew how close it came to ending that day, but it also never knew how far one man was willing to go to prevent that ending. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are performed by people history will never remember. Sometimes the most important decisions are made by individuals no one expects to care about the fate of humanity. And sometimes the survival of our species depends on a gangster from Harlem with a briefcase full of radio codes and the wisdom to use them not for destruction, but for salvation.